So, welcome to this session, everybody. I'm Simon Buckingham Shum, and we are going to be talking about why one does not simply accept interpretations, as was famously uttered in Lord of the Rings. This is a team effort in this symposium to explore the concept of participatory QE, and the form it's going to take is a series of short presentations, 10 minutes each, to just share our current thinking about this concept, which may well have moved on a little bit since we first wrote the symposium proposal. And then we really want to throw it open for some community discussion. Okay, so I'm going to kick things off and basically ask, whose truth are we talking about when we conduct our studies? This is a fundamental question. We want our field to be ethical. We want our field to be scientifically rigorous. And we also want our field to be honoring the fact that there are multiple narratives and interpretations of what something means. And that's pretty important for a field like QE. Another way, which I'm going to just use a few slides from my keynote last year, just to sort of pick up that conversation. That who are we talking to, and do they get to interpret? And I should perhaps have asked a third question, which is not only interpret, but change the way that we think about what's going on in the world. As researchers, you know, we go into a world. We try and understand how they think about the world, and we're observing and using the best discipline we have to then move through data and coding and visualization with different kinds of outcomes, depending on whether we're just being academics and producing papers and talks and tools and interventions, or maybe we're actually making interventions of some sort back into this world, or maybe we're embedding QE in tools. Okay, now the fundamental, that's not a problem. This is about establishing a new scholarly discipline. This is what you do. However, what we are asking is whether there needs to be a feedback loop, for example, which is validating the visualizations back with the stakeholders. And perhaps this is not the only loop. Perhaps the stakeholders can be involved in other stages of the process. I mean, we decide what data we're going to gather. Might stakeholders be involved in helping us decide what data we should gather? Perhaps they already are. We code the data according to some scheme. Is there scope for stakeholders to be involved more in the classification schemes we're using before we move to data visualization? So this was one example inspired by the work I had been seeing by people like Gol and Hazel and Mike in their QE webinars, which I thought was so exciting. And then in my talk, I basically looked at a range of different strategies, research strategies and design strategies that we can use to open up the QE research process. I talked about malleable representations and the whole discipline there is already of studying why a diagrammatic representation has value, coming out of cognitive ergonomics, coming out of cognitive science and human-computer interaction. In terms of making our representations more accessible, I talked about different narrative generation techniques and technologies that might even help with the interpretation of these diagrams. I talked about the idea of QE inside, a bit like Intel inside, powering other tools, right? QE will sink into the infrastructure as it matures, which means that we will be using simplified representations to feed back to people who cannot make sense of a full-blown ENA diagram. And I talked about the skill set of engaging participants in the co-construction of a representation, building on work that I've done previously in this field. So what we're going to hear from our colleagues in a moment is where they're at in some of these spaces, or perhaps in additional spaces. And then we're going to conclude by outlining some of the open and interesting research questions we think PQE will have to wrestle with if it's going to go forwards. I'll finish with this slide. I think that so far what we've been doing is building really sound science and ethnography and whatever, and the intersection between those, and developing that rigor that allows us to make, robust claims. But we're also now injecting the need to temper that with humility, because we want to bring in other voices who may challenge what we're saying. And we're talking here about both of these, recognizing and valuing the difference between an analytical outsider ethic worldview and the insider emic worldview. And some of the interesting questions that come up are when there's a clash between those. Which one wins? Do we need to even frame it as which one wins? Is it that the emic, has value even if it conflicts with the ethic? Could they both be true, but they serve different purposes? And that's okay. Or if we have inconsistency between the analytical coding and analysis we've done and how non-technical experts, as in non-QE technical experts, make sense of that, if they're seeing things that they don't recognize, does that mean we must change our analysis? So I think there are some really interesting questions that come up when we start to do this. And we really look forward to your thoughts, whether you're in this session live or watching it as a replay later, because there's so much great stuff going on, as we wrestle with what PQE might mean as a distinctive strand of the whole QE community. Okay, I'm going to stop there and pass the mic over to Mike. And he's going to take us on the next step of the journey.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, and it is literally talking about the journey that I've been on in terms of participatory quantitative ethnography. And I originally talked about potentially using the P to amplify the E, but I always get inspired when I hang around people in this community with their creativity and the ways in which they're able to label things. So I tried to come up with a better title for this. I don't think I've quite nailed it yet, but I thought about maybe minding your P's and Q's when it comes to PQE. I don't know whether that's actually totally nailed it or not, but so there might be a prize in the Slack channel if somebody can come give me a better option. But I think it's really important that we do think about what we're talking about, the language that we use and the way that we represent things, because it has a really big impact on the ethnographic component of the work that we do in this space. And where this began for me, so this idea of the journey, was actually some data that I collected in 2018 and presented at the first ICQE conference that really started this participatory journey for me. I was really interested in teachers, their knowledge and their decision making, and I was looking at 6 different teachers, 2 math teachers, 2 science teachers and 2 computer science teachers, and the way that their data from their lesson plans became visualized. And so the math teachers on the left, the science teachers in the center, and the computer science teachers on the right were people that I had been working with for a number of years. I knew these people pretty well. And when I saw the visualization from the computer science teachers, it kind of was like, I don't think that this actually represents who these people are. And so because of the mistake that I'd made in the way that I'd collected data and some assumptions that I'd made, I realized that there was a problem with what the data was telling me. So I went back to the teachers and asked them what their interpretation was. And so this was my first involvement with participatory quantitative ethnography. And what these teachers told me revealed a whole lot of mistakes and assumptions that I'd made along the way. And so that became a really important focus for me. And so what I then did was moved on and started a different kind of an idea. And Simon really picked up on something that resonated with me, that this notion that we want QE that validates with stakeholders, that we actually go from the etic to the emic and back again, and that there's a connection between these two. That probably should actually be a double-headed arrow looking at that again now. The next step in my PQE journey is a project that I've been doing over the last year or so. It's a program that works with 100 in-service teachers here in Australia. They work in fully online or virtual K-12 schools, and I'm putting them through a professional learning program over 6 weeks. And essentially, I wanted to get to know these people before I started working with them, because I realized that if I didn't know those computer science teachers, I just would have taken on face value what the data was telling me, and that was problematic. So I wanted to get to know these people before I started working with them. And then I also wanted to see potentially what kinds of changes or what impacts this professional learning program had. But I didn't just want to interview these people and it to be a typical kind of interview one-way conversation where I was gathering data about them. I wanted them to be active contributors to the research process. I wanted them to be for us to be able to explore both these etic and emic understandings of who they are and how they understood their work. But the big question was, how was I going to do that? And a number of years before the ICQE21 presentation that Simon gave, he gave a professorial speech in the UK where he talked about the fact that prose is really dense, it's really intimidating, and it's really hard to get into. And this is actually data from the interviews that I conducted with these teachers, and it's huge. There's a massive data set that's really hard to understand. It is really difficult to get into for us as researchers who have the time to do that. So how am I going to get my participants to be involved? So if prose is really dense, it's really intimidating, and it's really hard to get into, then I know what we could do is we could draw a picture, and we could give them an image like this, a visualization of that data, and we could start to have them talk about that. Well, that worked with the 2 teachers who I knew, and there were relatively few connections in that kind of image. But when I've got 100 teachers and when I've got 9 codes that I'm working with, showing them an E&A visualization is just simply not going to work. It's just too difficult, too complex for people to get their heads around. So what if we actually started to provide a way to be able to visualize this data that was more porous, that allowed people to actually be able to make contributions to, and to be able to justify those contributions. So I was lucky enough to be working with Zach Sawecki, who's another fantastic member of the QE community, and he built me a tool that laid out things in a different way. And I was lucky enough to be involved in a webinar just over a month or so ago, I think, with Hazel, where I showed some of this data. So if you wanted to go back and get a bit more in-depth understanding of that, you can go and have a look. But what I wanted to do was to have an opportunity for participants to be able to work with a shared repertoire, to work with a cognitive artifact that they could contribute to. And so what I asked Zach to do was to simply get my 9 codes and lay them out in a circle. There was no semantic meaning, no meaning at all in terms of where these were located. And in a conversation that followed the presentation in that webinar, David started asking some questions, as he often does, and pointed out some of the problems that were associated with just laying these things out in a circle. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But my idea was, if I could actually explain one of the ideas in E&A, thicker lines, stronger connections, thinner lines, weaker connections, and if I was then able to help develop a shared repertoire by actually giving these teachers a simplified version of my code book, so a one-page document that I sent to them with a little video. They then had a language that they could use. They could hopefully understand thicker and thinner lines, and then they could be actively involved in a conversation about how they might see their visualization looking. And that's exactly what I did. So these conversations were done over Zoom. And here you can see a teacher who's just simply using the annotate tool in Zoom to show me what she thinks her visualization should look like. And so what we can start to see is what a simplified ENA visualization might look like. And we're getting the idea of what she thinks might come out of this. But when I started doing this with some other teachers, we got some really interesting things going on. So here's another teacher. So would you like to have a go at showing me what you reckon your So this teacher then starts drawing a similar kind of thing to the teacher beforehand, and he's making some connections, but then all of a sudden he changes color. And in ENA, a change in color usually represents a subtracted visualization. And this teacher wasn't doing that. He was talking about different components of his work. And then he does this crazy thing with circles. And we don't do circles in ENA. So all of a sudden, what he was showing me was that there was this really different way of actually interpreting his understanding of his world. And it didn't necessarily resonate with the way that we would represent that in an ENA visualization. So what we actually have were these ways that we were able to combine both emic and etic visualizations. So the top left was the way a teacher thought her visualization might look like. When we analyzed the data from the interview, what we got was down the bottom right. And this was a typical thing that we started to find, was that the teachers themselves didn't necessarily see the complexity in their work that was revealed in their interview data. And so what we're actually able to then do is overlay both the emic and the etic visualizations and start to get that sort of sense of a subtracted network. So we're starting to get a little bit further down the path than where I started, just simply by taking a visualization back to these teachers and then telling me where I got this wrong. Here we've actually got a way to be able to start to capture that and start to show how that might play out. And at the end of that webinar that I mentioned that Hazel and I did about a month or so ago, I said, well, perhaps what we might want to start considering are these notions of emic tools and etic tools. I don't necessarily like the idea of simplified and more complex tools, because I don't think that necessarily helps us when we're talking with our participants. I think it has a connotation of power and control. But I was thinking about this idea of kind of two separate suites of tools. Well, one of the things that the amazing team from Wisconsin, and in particular Cody, Carl and David, came up with in less than a month was building on that idea that David had, saying, well, it's actually maybe not such a great practice to have no meaning in the placing of the nodes, because that's a really important component of what ENA does. So what if we actually took an ENA visualization like this, and we were able to have meaning in the position and the size of the nodes, but still simplify it somewhat, and we were able to come up with this. And in less than a month, that's exactly what they've done. And in the web tool now, if you wanted to start to play around with this, you can now start to do this too. So if you go into the model tab and into codes, and then click on the advanced options, what you'll find are that there are three options here: optimized unit circle, and the unit circle equally spaced is one that actually positions these within the ENA web tool, allows you to do all the other fantastic things that you can do with ENA, with goodness of fit and other kinds of tests, and still run all of those, but allows participants to be able to be actively involved with a shared repertoire within the web tool itself. So that's the most recent step in my PQE journey. And I'm going to hand over to Mamta and to Holly to hear about what they've been up to.
Thank you, Mike. I'm always learning from all of you about even just sort of recraft my PQE story. So let me, I guess everyone can see the screen, my slide. Yeah. So good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
We can't see your slides, Mamta.
You cannot? Oh, sorry. All right. Oh, I know what I did. Now you can, right?
You're good.
Okay, perfect. So good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mamta Shah, and I'm a learning scientist at Elsevier. My background is in EdTech, game-based learning, and teacher education, and I lead efficacy research in nursing and health education. And today I am accompanied by my wonderful colleague, Holly Moots, who is a nursing education expert, a former nurse, nursing faculty, a former nursing faculty specializing in simulation-based education. And we really hope to provide you a more systems perspective of embracing PQE. And it's really up to you to decide whether our approach is inside out or outside in. I want to spend a few minutes setting the context for how PQE grew on me. And I'll begin with my participation in the early career workshop during the first ICQE, when I was fairly new in my current role. I was exploring my identity of being a learning scientist in an industry setting and thinking about how I wanted to shape this role. Among the many takeaways I brought home, David and Karen's advice about building bridges really stayed with me. And back when I came back to my work, building bridges really involved engaging in many conversations with colleagues who approached the business or the business of developing tools for nursing education. Everyone saw the business or what we were serving from multiple vantage points: nursing education experts, content experts, product managers, business leaders, marketing and sales colleagues, and each one had a unique perspective and stake in the products we made for nursing and health education and the educational problems that needed to be addressed. And these conversations helped me identify one area where QE would offer a really rich approach. So nursing education adopts a variety of simulation modalities to help students develop the cognitive, social, and psychomotor skills that are needed for clinical readiness. However, faculty really experience challenging assessing the complexity of simulation-based education and showcase how and when students are practicing those skills. So around the time of this deliberation, we were also planning pilot studies for a new product line around virtual reality simulations for nursing students, undergraduate nursing students. And using this collective knowledge, I reached out to Rudis, David, Simon, pitching a really sort of initial idea. And this led to a poster in ICQE21. But more importantly, I was able to produce a small but a worked example that helped me make a case for quantitative ethnography back to my colleagues and really pitch how we can use this novel research method to examine the efficacy of educational technologies. So while at ICQE20, I heard Simon's keynote about participatory sense making, and it really evoked new thoughts about bridging EMIC and ETIC worlds. And reflecting on his presentation, it really helped me crystallize that the context I was operating in are both industry and academia, research and practice, nursing education, and educational technology. So what was EMIC and what is ETIC really evolves constantly for me and based on where I position myself at a given time. So the next step really in this journey was to build a team that offered mirrors and windows to each other as we examined the efficacy of this virtual reality simulations for nursing education. And this is when Holly and Amanda Siebert Evenstone and Brendan Egan from University of Wisconsin-Madison and we all began collaborating. And the beauty of our team was that we cut across academia and industry, and through our interdisciplinary expertise as researchers and educators in learning sciences, QE, EdTech, simulations, and nursing allowed us to make not only methodological and theoretical decisions in our examinations, but also be mindful of how we were communicating our findings to a business audience and an academic audience. So here we are at ICQE21, and I'm hoping that with the world opening up again and our bridge will take a new form, much like the one that we're seeing right now. Seamless sort of interaction between academia and industry and multiple stakeholders. And at this point, I want to invite Holly to share a few ideas that we are currently exploring.
Thank you, Mamta. We have begun thinking of ways that we can lower the floor, widen the walls, and heighten the ceiling so we can engage our internal and external stakeholders more actively in our QE endeavors. So while we continue strengthening the case for QE in efficacy research and growing the team, we're thinking aloud with more specific ideas based on our contextual knowledge. Now at Elsevier, nursing faculty, administrator, and students' needs and feedback heavily impact our product conception, development, delivery, and management. We also publish infographics and white papers on an array of topics. We host webinars and training sessions guiding faculty on how to augment their instruction using our learning solutions. And perhaps the first step towards adopting PQE could be the way in which we disseminate existing work to the nursing audience who may not be fluent with QE yet. For instance, we can release companion videos to our QE reports that translate the crux of the investigations in an accessible manner, highlighting the key findings and putting some emphasis on implications for them and their programs. QE research is time and labor intensive, and currently this impacts the time that elapses between coding, code validation, model exploration, and member checking after concrete models are generated. We're also cognizant about the time that we can spend synchronously with our participants. Perhaps spacing out participant involvement and member checking over routine intervals might prove beneficial for practical purposes. For instance, debriefing is commonly adopted in simulation sessions to help students assimilate knowledge, skills, and attitudes essential for patient care and well-being. Nurse educators also use this time to dialogue with their students about what happened, what went well or didn't go well, and what can be improved on in the future. We can expand that debriefing tradition to include ethnographic prompts that elicit participants' reflections on what happened in the distinct phases of pre-brief, simulation, and debrief using a grounded approach and/or anchored in relevant theoretical concepts. Those insights can be used by researchers then to make decisions about coding and model exploration. And the layered storytelling approach used in Simon's work to help faculty and students make sense of multimodal data obtained from nursing simulations is compelling. We think scaling the technology and access to explanatory visualizations can vastly complement simulation experiences. For instance, in nursing, it's imperative that students be exposed to a wide variety of clinical situations, especially in ways that reduce the complexities of clinical practice, make implicit practice of expert nurses explicit, and sequence learning activities according to those developmental progressions. These strategies can make authentic practice accessible to learners. Perhaps in generating a bank of explanatory and interactive visualizations of expert and novice nurses engaging in simulation across multiple nursing domains, we can help students and faculty peel back those layers, really meddle with those what-if situations, and reflect on transforming how we support clinical readiness.
Thank you, Holly. I guess that's the end of where we are at our journey right now, and we really hope that our presentation resonates with you and energizes you to consider ways for expanding participatory approaches in your QE work. So thank you. And over to Cole and Hazel.
Okay, let me show my presentation mode. Can you see my slides? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I am Hazel, and I think I forgot to introduce myself in my last presentation, so I'm gonna do that right now. that everybody knows me. So I'm Hazel, and I am a PhD candidate in the Learning Sciences program at Clemson University. I'm also associated with the Idea Lab and Universidad de Costa Rica. So Cole and I will be talking about how we're thinking about the development of participatory QE tools, which is like what we have been lately in the last months, I think over a year. We've been investing quite some time thinking about this, and we don't have the answers, but we have been doing some work and reflecting on it. Of course, okay. And so a participatory QE stands in the field of QE is really making us look laser focused at the researcher and participant role in the research process. And so using quantitative ethnography lens to this, we're thinking about the roles in this relationship in closing the interpretative loop together. What about the researcher and the participant closing that loop together, and what it means and what it implies, particularly for the tools that we use to do so. Because as I said in my presentation yesterday, we already have a really nice common ground to start to do this thinking in QE. And so what we're doing here is maximizing the researcher participant relationship and the co-construction that can happen in closing this interpretative loop together. While doing this, we are including the multiple ways of knowing and ways of doing that participants and all stakeholders bring to the research process. But we're also allowing and creating those bridges, as the previous presentation said, that participants can start to shape this paradigm and what that could look like. So in order to do this, we need to extend and challenge our own definitions of QE and what it means to do QE work. So in our own work, we have been working on the identity of Spanish-speaking English language teachers, how they are negotiating and confronting existing tensions during pre-service teachers, and more recently in their novice experiences. So we have found that there's a prominent figure that is the native English speaker. And this is an idealized concept that has an impact on these teachers, particularly leaving them with feelings of frustration, linguistic insecurity, or inadequacy. And so one way in which we have done that is through interview data. And as researchers, we collect that data, coded it, and then generated ENA networks that we then took to a third interview with participants, where we use the networks to think together with them. And these networks were annotated at the time. What I had, the tool that I could think of was my dear iPad here. And so I annotated live what participants were saying and how they were thinking about these networks. So in this ENA discussions, what we noticed is that they either added connections to these networks, they modified codes, they also thought about changing the thickness of the lines, and they reacted to codes. So mostly what happened here was co-creation of this thick description. And while this was really a really nice playing ground for us to start thinking about participatory QE. We also noticed that there were some limitations in the participation that we gave to our participants. And so what we're trying to do in our current work, which is my dissertation, and this is pretty much in the works. So I'm sharing as much as I can, and with the hopes that we can all think together and help a little bit that research that is right now in process. So what we're thinking here is sharing, and this is a new set of participants, new participants that haven't seen these networks. And the way that I have been approaching this is providing them with a network about Costa Rica, because they are from Costa Rica. So it's something that's familiar to them, something that that is also meaningful for them. But I don't start with this network like this. I show a progression of all of the different elements that Gol and I thought that were important for us to preserve in the networks. So I start by providing this, that would be the codes or the themes that we label here. So I start, and this is a conversation. So I ask them, so what do you think? This is an imaginary network and research. So it's imaginary codes that tourists say about Costa Rica. And so they say, well, maybe they said beaches because of such and such, and maybe relaxation, and maybe pura vida. And then I move to, so these are the notes, the codes, the codes. And then I move to the notes. And then I point to the different sizes and what that may mean in the construction of these networks. And then we start to look at the connections between these themes or these codes. And we start thinking about what those connections may mean, right? And so I provide them with these quotes about what the connection between nature and pura vida would be, or the connection between pura vida and beaches, or the connection between beaches and nature, and so on and so forth for the rest of the network until we complete the whole network of what people think, tourists think about Costa Rica. And so when the network is complete, they provide their interpretation. I tell them, so what's the story that you see in this network before I say anything? And I also come up with my own interpretation, which intentionally is simpler, and also highlight that there might be different interpretations to this network. And so far, this is where we're at right now. So we are in the second interview where I've shared this with them. And the next step that they're doing is that they are creating their own networks. So I'm providing them with this template in Google Slides, something like very simple that they can manipulate. And so what they have to do is choose a theme, something relevant that they think that they have discussed with me in the previous 2 interviews. And what they do is that they drag themes here. This would be their working space, and they would also drag the notes, and they would also drag the different lines, and they would choose the thickness of the lines. So they're going to use this network for to bring it to the next interview. And I will also work on my own network. So they will bring their own network, but I will also bring my network with the understanding of the data that I have so far, not using the ENA tool yet, because I haven't provided this analysis, but my reading of the data. Then the output of the ENA network will probably come down the line. But this is what we're thinking so far, and this is where our work is very much like not even out of the oven, still in the oven, but we wanted to share this with you. And so what all of this work has provided is some implications and wonderings. So again, we have more questions than answers for this. And so this reimagining of the roles of the researcher and the participant is making us think, what are the types of expertise and how can they be leveraged? And of course, as Simon was saying, like, you know, there will be tensions about, especially when things clash and maybe my participants' interpretations and my interpretations are different. So what do we do with those tensions, and what would be those next steps? As we think about how we're shaping the future of QE tools. We're thinking, again, our major concern for Go and I in our conversations, how we can think about this low threshold, something that's accessible for all stakeholders, but allows us to imagine, to interpret, to come up with these deep interpretations that that we as QE researchers really are used to, and also something that contributes to the participants. And the last part is just thinking about, reflecting about the choices that we're making. And here we are making those choices right now, and how we are thinking about the purposes behind and the reasonings behind those choices. But part of what we're doing here is just thinking, why don't we develop these tools and imagine these tools with our own participants? So that would make this PQE even more participatory. So this is where we're at in our thinking so far. I think I should give the floor to Abby, right?
Yeah, I'm next. Okay, I think you all should be able to see my screen now. Yeah. Okay, super. Hi, so I'm Abby Woldridge, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach at this, where I'm going to pull in a framework from another field that's focused on participatory work called Participatory Ergonomics. So if you don't know me, I'm an ergonomist by training. I found QE during grad school and have been mixing it and integrating it in my ergonomics research. So I think that this could actually be a really useful paradigm for us to learn from. Participatory QE is not really the first or only call for more participation across any number of disciplines, right? And I think that's been mentioned today already. So I'm pulling from the one that I know, Participatory Ergonomics, which is essentially involving people in the planning and controlling a significant amount of their own work. So ergonomics is about work. And providing them with sufficient knowledge and power to influence their work and their outcomes to achieve their own goals. So I think that we've actually been kind of doing that, or at least I've been hearing about colleagues doing that, just replace work with whatever the phenomena they're studying here. So in participatory ergonomics, they have a big framework that they can use to describe different participatory ergonomics efforts. So when we were organizing this symposia, I got to thinking that it might be a nice idea for us to have a couple dimensions that we agree on influence how participatory a PQE piece of work is, that we could use to describe our work, so that we can compare and contrast and learn from each other with kind of a similar taxonomy. So I borrowed and augmented the participatory ergonomics framework and suggest that we use 7 different dimensions to describe how participatory our work is. So for example, are we going to have the participatory part of the project be permanent or kind of temporary? So for example, do you do interviews with folks and allow them to construct their own networks? Or do you maybe integrate folks that you're studying on your research team to help you articulate the questions that you want to answer? When you're involving those people, how are they selected? If they're doing participatory work as part of your data collection, then maybe it's sort of a delegated representation. They have been identified as an expert in this area, or perhaps it's even kind of a convenient sample. They were willing to participate. Or maybe there's some other way if you involve them more fully. Did their peers say this is someone who should be involved in studying their research questions that you all are going to study? Or do you involve everyone in a full direct participation process? How you go about making decisions is something that I think Mike was really touching on, particularly this idea of how do you balance the EMIC and the EDIC. So there could be something you need to balance there, and how you make that decision, whether it's the whole group or the researchers consult the participants as a group holistically or individually, for example. I didn't change the mix of participants from the ergonomics framework, because I think this really depends on what discipline you're working in. So my participant mix will always look like that for ergonomics work, but it might be different if you're in, say, a learning setting. Maybe it's students, teachers, teaching aides, administrators, and so on. I'm pretty sure that our requirement, since we're all doing research here, is always going to fall in the voluntary pile, but I guess it's possible that we may not be in that setting for some reason. The role of the scientist or the person who's the expert in QE is important, whether they're guiding the whole process or just serving more as a consultant, providing expertise or training, or just available if the population that's leading the research is actually the participants themselves. And then lastly, the goal and scope. In other words, what is the participatory QE project aiming to do? So I propose these 7 dimensions as something we could use when we're writing and saying we are doing this participatory QE project on X. Perhaps describing all of these would be analogous to, say, describing our model fit when we have our ENA models. Now in ergonomics, when I'm teaching about participatory ergonomics, I always talk about why it's important. And I usually center it around the idea that we're starting to move more and more towards human-centered design, and to be human-centered, we have to actually engage with our humans who are going to use whatever we're doing. But this really prioritizes the workers or the participants as the experts in that work. In other words, without using the same terminology we use in QE, we're valuing the EMIC view of the workers at least equally, if not more than the EDIC view of the ergonomics experts. In other words, to be human-centered, we have to fully center the human's perspective in the problem. So I think this is coming back to some of the discussion that we've had already, and might even feed into some of the future discussion about how we negotiate that interaction between EMIC and EDIC, particularly if they might conflict. So I think these are future ideas to talk more about, and I intentionally kept this short in case we were running behind schedule, because I know we wanted to have some discussion. So I'll just close with this. In the ergonomics field, we've essentially decided that we have to give ergonomics away to have the biggest, broadest, most lasting impact we can have. Our field's too small to keep it tucked away and not share it. So one of the questions that I would pose to this community is, should we do the same thing for QE? And I don't know who's leading the next. I think it might be Mike.
I think you might be right. Thanks, Abby. So one of the things that we've done collectively as a group is start to think about what are the kinds of questions that people have been talking about today? How might we start to bring some of these ideas together? And what might that mean in terms of a research agenda for participatory quantitative ethnography? So we don't necessarily have answers for any or all of these questions, but I think that they're interesting ones just to consider as a way to kind of bring all the presentations together. So can we differentiate the degrees of participation? So how much agency do we give participants, and how early should they be engaged in the process? Which aspects of QE analysis are contestable, and which ones do we want to put to one side and keep outside of what researchers might be, participants might be thinking? The second one is, are there QE contexts where participant engagement might be particularly valuable? And are there others where this may be not something that is particularly relevant? The third one, what are the advantages for us as researchers in making our analyses accessible to stakeholders? What kinds of evidence of the benefits are convincing to justify this kind of member checking, if we want to call it member checking? And that's another sub-question within this one. So if there are advantages to us as researchers, then the next obvious question is, well, what are the costs? What are the costs in terms of time, in terms of training for us in developing PQE methods, but also in terms of training our participants to be able to participate? What does it mean for funding and participant access? And are there ways that we can mitigate some of these kinds of costs? Again, complex questions that I don't think we necessarily have the answers to now, but are important ones for us to think about if we're going to continue down this particular path. What are the methodological implications if participants disagree with our analysis? A few people have mentioned that, Abby, most recently. What happens when participants say that's actually not right? What does it mean if we allow participants to change the results of a representation and in turn the change in the meaning or the validity of the analysis? What does that mean in terms of the methodology that we're using? A few people have also talked about the notion of, can the emic and the etic lens both be correct at the same time? Do they serve different purposes? Or is this really problematic and untenable? And are there situations where we might be saying these two can sit in tension with one another? And there are other times, other examples where we don't want to think about that as being the case, not necessarily a one-size-fits-all answer. How can we, in the process of bridging both this emic and etic world, strive for greater research and practice integration? How can research and practice come together to give us a better sense of what the implications are as a result of this kind of work? And then the last few sort of coalesce around the idea of software requirements and design. So what software requirements might engaging participants develop, and what can we learn from related fields? So like Abby was talking about ergonomics, how might we start to look at other fields that have been involving participatory practices for some time, and what can we learn from them? What are the visual and design interaction principles and researcher skills, really importantly, that we might need to develop to engage participants in ways that empower them? So just like I was talking about, the notion of having no semantic meaning in the design that I came up with was highly problematic. It allowed participants to engage, but as a researcher, I needed to think a little bit more about the skills that I needed in terms of the design principles to be able to make meaning out of that. And then finally, what kinds of pedagogical practices can we introduce by empowering participants to use QE tools? How might we start to think about the importance of that as part of our research? So those are 10 kind of burning questions that we've come up with, not necessarily, as I said, having answers to them, but things that we will likely to all be considering as we continue to move down the path of participatory quantitative ethnography. But one of the things that we really wanted to do was to hear from you and to have an opportunity for some questions and answers. So Mamta, do you want to kick us off into the Q&A component of this symposium?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. I am looking at the time, and I know at the top of the hour, we're all transitioning into a participatory QE community chat. So how about we take one question from anyone? We're a relatively small group. And then that gives us enough time to address it. And also Abby can then close the session, and then we can hop to the community chat. So one burning question. Well, I'll definitely start off with a big round of applause to everyone. I don't think we took a moment to appreciate all the rich ideas that were being shared. So to all of us.
So I have a question, and it actually comes from a session I was in earlier today. And we were talking about participatory QE, but it sounded to me like the way all of us were using the term meant something different. And I can't remember if we actually have in the paper, what does PQE mean? What is that? And I'm not answering since I asked it. I don't have to.
I mean, I'll take a shot at it. I think my ideas about PQE, as I mentioned in the slides, definitely grew from listening to Mike and Gol and Hazel talk about their work and Simon's presentation, where I really try to sort of operationalize it in our context. Like, what does it mean? Like, can we start directly at the participants? Or do we really need to sort of first have an open dialogue about what QE means and what it can offer for us and our stakeholders who are each trying to address challenges in nursing and health education? So maybe I'm not fully answering this question, but I definitely think that we had to sort of take the PQE lens and ground it in our context and find some operationalization there, and even sort of how we approached it there. So if that helps. Not a formal definition, but one way how we're approaching it. Anyone else?
Abby, I think part of this is trying to find that maybe common ground, or if there is a common ground, maybe that's one of our goals, to try to find a definition that we all maybe can agree on or contribute to, or maybe we won't be able to, I don't know. But I think in our proposal, our symposium proposal, at least in the beginning, we did not define it. It was more like, here's what participatory research is, and here's how we think it can influence QE. And then I think in the Hazel and I section, we started to kind of define it as at least the way that we see it. So, you know, that would be a really interesting in-depth conversation to have, is kind of each of us perhaps in the future can sort of define it and then see, you know, where we overlap, and if that's a goal of this group moving forward.
I have a thought, which is all of the examples we've seen make perfect sense to engage the stakeholders, because we're talking about understanding how they see themselves or their own practice. So, you know, the most obvious thing in the world is to feed it back to them to say, does this resonate with how you see yourself, right? You're the world expert on how you see yourself. But if you were doing an analysis, which was, for example, bringing in quite an esoteric theoretical perspective to study discourse, right? Using a whole bunch of constructs and a body of scholarship that will, of course, be completely alien to the participants, might that be an example where, you know, it's not going to work so well because there's so much they don't understand about the codes you're using, etc. You know, so it's an example like that that might be one we want to think about as counter examples. You know, can we think of really good examples where it might not make sense? On the other hand, I could imagine a counter argument that says you still should be doing this, absolutely, but there's obviously more translational work to do.
Thank you all. Abby, may I hand it over to you for closing our session?
Yeah. So thanks very much for joining us tonight. As mentioned, we are going to be hopping over to the Zoom link for the community chat and interest group. So I hope you're able to join us there. And if you're not able to join us there, even if you are, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you want. So thanks a lot. Mamta just dropped into the chat the link to the next interest group session. So thanks very much. And with that, great work to all my fellow panelists. I was really enjoying hearing about your research. So thank you all.